You listen to this podcast because you like books, or maybe because you like learning, or maybe you just like the sound of my voice lulling you to sleep. If it's the first two, Audible has you covered. Too busy to read? Driving and don't want to run into another dog? Audible is a huge library of audiobooks where people read to you like you're a kid again. And guess what? You can try it out for free. Just go to readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to sign up for your free trial today.
Walt Whitman has that great famous quote, I'm large, I contain multitudes. And it was about how we each contain so many different personalities, that we have different voices and we can be inconsistent and still be true to ourselves. What the digital age has done is it's no longer that we contain multitudes, it's that we are multitudes, that my versions of myself extend beyond my body.
Hello, and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 17. We've almost graduated from high school. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with Andrew Ervin about his book, Bit by Bit. Andrew Ervin is the author of the novels Burning Down George Orwell's House and Extraordinary Renditions. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, and several other places. He lives in Philadelphia and teaches at Temple University. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Read, Learn, Live. My name is John Monaster. I'm your host. I am here today with Andrew Ervin, author of Bit by Bit. Andrew, say hello.
Hello, everybody.
All right, thanks for being here. We're real excited. So the first thing I always love to do, Andrew, let's just hear a little bit about the book. Why don't you summarize it for us, what the main themes are all about?
Thanks, John. I'd love to. Bit by Bit is a nonfiction book about my personal journey through almost 60 years of video game history. I went back to look at how the medium originated in the late 1950s and tried to play a lot of the games in their original incarnations through the 60s and 70s up through the Atari age and online console games today.
Great. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the writing process first, and then we can delve into the book itself and everything in there, which was really interesting. But just to start off with, I mean, why did you decide to write this book? You've written other stuff before. You've clearly got a passion for video games, but why did you decide that this was the right time to write this book?
Well, I'm a novelist, so I have two works of fiction out already, and
Mm-hmm.
I became curious. Having trained as a reader and a critic and an author of fiction, I realized at a certain point that I was missing out on this whole world of video games. I was never a serious gamer until it came time to write this book. So I'm bringing sort of an outsider perspective to the medium a little bit. And it was clear to me that I was missing out on this huge phenomenon, that video games are everywhere. And if we're not paying attention to it, we can sort of miss how omnipresent they are in our culture. So I got interested in trying to sort of look at what I was missing. And it turns out this medium is fascinating. It's wonderful. It's brilliant. It's far more artistic than I would have guessed. But if we got that argument from a dedicated gamer, I don't know if it would carry the same weight. There are a
Mm.
lot of great books about video games by serious gamers, and you'll learn a lot by reading them. But I tried to frame the medium more in terms of the history of art or contemporary art.
Yeah, I noticed, and I thought that was a really interesting direction. So you've written a couple other books, and I was just curious about your writing and editing process, and maybe even compare what it was like to write a nonfiction book versus a fiction book.
I've sworn in the past that I would never write nonfiction because I thought it would be so difficult. The
Yeah.
idea of having to fact check myself and get every detail and date correct was a little bit daunting at first. I
Hmm.
can't lie about that. Where in fiction, I can rearrange towns. I can make time swing however I want. I don't have that luxury in this book. There's an enormous number of footnotes. It's incredibly detailed in its research, um, simply because I needed to get the facts right, but I also needed to show respect for a medium in which I had not been participating as much as a lot of people.
Hmm.
So it's also the first book which was under contract before I wrote it, which meant I had a deadline, which I don't have with my novels, although I would like to write them quickly or not spend a decade doing them. With this book, with Bit by Bit, I had a due date. And that really turned out to be extremely helpful and useful.
Hmm.
So I would write every day. Um, I would play different video games every day on different devices. It was my entire focus for about a year and a half. And it took me longer to write that, but I was also doing other things, the beginning and tail end of it.
Yeah. So, what was the hardest part of all that, or did it all sort of flow pretty well once you got going?
I found the fact checking to be quite challenging at times.
Mm.
There's st- learning statistics about sales of games and things like that. I would think that it would be very straightforward to find a lot of this information, but there aren't organized sites yet that do everything as far as sales numbers and
Hmm.
popularity and things like that. So there's a bit more detective work than I anticipated. Um,
Hmm.
I also don't like sitting still for that
Yeah.
many hours a day. And so I found it challenging to stay in my chair or in front of a. Yeah, and when I'd leave my computer and stop writing, I'd go to the TV and I'd pick up the controller and I'd play another game. Or on my iPhone, find another game to write about. So the constant uh, switching between screens, I think, got a little wearing. Um,
Hmm.
and I blew through my eyeglass prescription pretty quickly too. So
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I'm staring at a screen all day too. I always try and stand up, take a break. You're supposed to like focus on something far away, right? And just trying to make sure your eyes don't get too overloaded.
that's it
So,
exactly. And again,
yeah.
I don't want to complain about writing a book about video games because
Yeah.
it's also the most enjoyable thing in the world. I've done hard jobs. I've done construction jobs. I've done, this isn't the challenges that I faced here are not the sorts of challenges that are worth complaining about too much.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one challenge that I thought was a bit interesting that I realized you started off with text-based games, and you can show the games in the book,
That's
but
right.
later on you've got video games are visual, and so I feel like a big part of your task was trying to describe what was happening in words, and it's kind of tricky. And so I was wondering how you kind of made that work.
That's a cool question. There's no really good way to do that, but there's really no good way to explain a Bosch painting to someone who can't see it. And there
Mm,
are a lot of art history books that don't have illustrations in them or don't have pictures. And so I read a lot of those, and I tried to get into the descriptions of the games um, in a way that hopefully the reader can visualize the screen. I would describe things, a character moving from left to right across a screen, for instance,
hmm.
in much the same way that somebody might broadcast a baseball game. Once we understand the general parameters or shape of the field of play, then I can better describe what happens upon it. So I
Mm,
tried to do that, but again, there's no substitute for playing the games. There's
yeah.
there's something a little bit contradictory about writing a book or even maybe even reading a book about video games. I think we're better off playing the games.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely found myself a couple times, pulling up YouTube and looking at some of the gameplay videos like that you were describing got posted, just so I had a better sense of what it actually felt like, and that was really helpful.
Yeah, YouTube has become a tremendous repository of information now. It's strange in a way that we rely on it so much. I hope that it's all being saved to a cloud somewhere. I hope it's all being protected like it would in a library because there's so much valuable information on there.
Yeah. Was there anything you found particularly inspiring or that amazed you while you were writing that you hadn't thought of before?
On the inspiring side of things, I spoke to a number of video game makers who are just individuals working at home with their computers
Hmm.
or with a sketch pad and then trying to recreate things on the computers and things like that. And it didn't sound all that different to me than thinking about a painter working with an easel or a sculptor working with a chunk of marble and some chisels. It's fascinating that it's the same kind of art that we think about in museums. We have individuals creating that now with digital pixels, and I
Hmm.
think it's very cool to see these tools, I suppose, being used by real artists, and uh, that was super exciting and super inspiring. There's a video game maker named Jason Rohrer who creates small, seemingly simple games by himself, but they are incredible artistic experiences where we feel emotional connections to his games. We go on these wild journeys. We experience philosophical ideas that I think there's that in a previous age he would have been writing manifestos um, or painting frescoes or something. Instead, he's working with pixels. Um,
Hmm.
Another one is Erin Robinson Swink, who's out in California. She made this game called Gravity Ghost all by herself. So it's almost like a passion project. It's this thing that somebody does, alone in the dark of their room, the way I write a book. So it's exciting for me and inspiring to see other forms of storytelling going on with this media.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's the real power of video games is that there's so many different ways that they can tell stories. It's great. So I want to get into the book itself for a little bit, and specifically, I want to start off with asking about the nature of the book. I mean, I thought it was going to be just a straight history of video games or critical theory of video games, but was really surprised to find out that it's also about you, like you mentioned. It's about you and your connections to video games, and it really felt like a memoir at times in terms of thinking about you and your family. What made you really want to take the book in that direction? I mean, you had a choice.
I did have a choice. I suppose I followed the material where the material led me. And
Mm,
the argument about that video games can take us on an emotional journey, I think there's no better way to demonstrate that than by to illustrate my own emotional journey and playing games, or to talk about the way that this medium has been part of my life to whatever large extent or small extent, almost as long as I can remember. So there's certainly a lot of it is personal. I talk about some a friend who suffered from terrible video game addiction and it ended up costing him his life in some roundabout way, or there might be some correlation to the end of his life and his addictive personalities. Uh, there's talk of nostalgia, of course, is a huge part of video gaming for many of us. The first games we played as kids will always be super important to us. So
right.
there's definitely a lot of my personal experience of games in this, but I hope that means that it reads that it creates a connection with the readers in a way that everyone can think of their own personal connections to this medium, even if we hadn't considered it before.
Mm. No, it's a great point. And yeah, the book was really personal. I think it definitely helped me connect both to you and to the games.
Did it inspire you to play any games?
No, that's an interesting point, and but I do. It has inspired me to look into a couple games, and especially Journey. I really liked,
Mhm,
which we'll get to later. So I do want to play that game now because that looks right up my alley. I'm not really a fan of violent video games,
mhm,
and I used to play a lot of games like Mario Kart and
mhm,
GoldenEye and that kind of stuff way back when. Interestingly, actually, I was going to ask you. I used to actually play a lot of MUDs, and you don't
mhm.
cover MUDs at all in the book, multi-user dungeons. And I was curious, maybe if you had a thought why.
There are a lot of things that I wish I could have covered that just
Yeah.
didn't fit into the narrative structure of the book. There is a sort of chronology that goes on. There is a story arc, for lack of a better term, um, which leads us to this chapter toward the end about my own dislike of violent games. That
Yeah.
a lot of people associate those games with the medium at whole or at large, and that's unfortunate because a lot of those games are truly awful.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, why don't we get into that? I mean, the book talks about this across a lot of video games, and some of even the origins of the games when it talks about the tenets for two based on how it was designed in terms of the calculations the guy had done for ballistic missile trajectories and the origin of the joystick and first person shooters. I mean, there's a lot of this that connects to the military, that connects to violence, and there's also a lot that doesn't. But it seems like the violent part is the one that gets the most attention, and like you said, can tend to give video games a bad name. So
Mm.
yeah, I'm really curious about why that connection between the military and video games persists, and why violent video games seem to get so much attention paid to them.
I think there's a lot to unpack in that question, John.
Sure,
For the
let's do
sake
it.
of context for our listeners here, uh, what I've described as the first video game was called Tennis for Two, and it was created in a government lab on Long Island in 1958. The man who created it, Willie Higginbotham, had worked on the electronic systems for the first nuclear bomb tests at Los Alamos. So this was a guy who was there at the origins of some of our most awful catastrophes of the 20th century. He went on to launch video games. And he used, as you mentioned, the missile trajectories for this Pong-like back and forth paddle game on an oscilloscope. And so the very origins of the medium start with some militaristic technology. Um, as games progressed from there, in 1961, a programmer named Steve Russell at MIT created a game called Space War. And it was very Cold War, two rocket ships flying around a screen trying to battle each other. We would think of it as the precursor to Asteroids, if people remember this game.
Hmm.
And it was only some government labs, usually with military funding or something like that. These were the only places that had computers that were capable of this sort of thing. So there's a connection between the military and video games that goes all the way back. Ralph Baer, who was, I think, incorrectly called the father of video games, had worked for a defense contractor. There's all along there's this correlation, and it wasn't until maybe the 1970s after the Vietnam War where some video game makers started to reject the militarism and look for other kinds of stories to
Hmm.
tell, things that weren't just shooting at each other. I think we got pretty sick of it. And yet that thread persists. There is still that core or that through line of video game history of violent shoot 'em up first person games. Um, those are important when we talk about the medium. They are probably the most popular games played today: Call of Duty and things like that, Assassin's Creed. Um, I don't like them. I find them tedious and disturbing, but that's what's popular. In much the same way it's the big blockbuster action movies that are popular, and not the little quiet indie films
Hmm.
that I might prefer. So my book is about that almost, I don't, underground's not the right way to put it, but this other tradition within the medium, this other through line of indie games, of independent thought, of different kinds of storytelling outside of the violence. The violence will always be there, and I understand why people associate that with the medium, but there's so much more going on in video games. And those are the cool games that I tried to write most about.
Yeah. And I think you do a great job. I mean, there are tons of games that I had never heard of that were mentioned, and some that I had.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think that's a great point. Um,
To get
so
back to, I'm sorry, to get back to your
yeah,
mud point, I would have loved to write about more of those, or some of those. There are so many games that I would have loved to write about. I didn't get to
yeah,
Shadow of the Colossus, on the
Hmm.
PS2, which is one of my all-time favorite games.
Yeah,
Or
I've heard of that game.
oh, it's awesome. There's a new game that I just started playing, relatively new to me, called Spelunky. That reminds me of Super Mario Brothers, but a little bit more intense in some ways, or more, even more interesting. So there's so many great games out there that aren't in the book. Um, so it's by no means a comprehensive history. But I think I make that very clear early in the book that it's going to be a very personal and selective look at the medium.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, getting into some personal stuff. I mean, you mentioned there's two kind of moral issues that you mentioned. There's broadly you mentioned the sin of cheating,
Mm-hmm.
and you mentioned how you talked about how you did that for some games, and then later in the book you talk about castle doctrine
Mm-hmm.
and some of the morally reprehensible choices that were available there. And I thought those were both interesting in that they kind of give you an opportunity to behave in a manner that you might not do in real life,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe it is how you behave in real life, and it's just going to be that how you play games is going to be reflexive of that.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about how you personally deal with morally reprehensible choices and cheating, and whether you think there's anything we can expand to people more broadly from that.
Well, there's an argument to be made here, and I think it's a compelling question that you raise. The correlation between our real life personalities here in meat space versus the actions and decisions we make in digital realms. And I don't think we are held to the same moral principles in a video game that we are in the real world, which is why we people play violent games. And it's entirely possible that those violent games allow us to fulfill some innate human urges, or experience different versions of ourselves in ways that's extremely healthy. Um, that hasn't proven the case for me as much, but I recognize why some people love that. People who I love rave about some of these violent games, and I completely get it. It's just not to my particular personal taste. So when we play a game like the Castle Doctrine, is by this man Jason Rohr, I mentioned. It's a game about defending your family, defending your possessions. You have a small digital house, and other people, other players online, can break in and take your money, or take your possessions, and it's your responsibility to fight them off. So you create traps for them, and you hide your stuff, and you can have guns and dogs. At the same time, you're expected to go break into their houses and steal their stuff. So it's there. There are great moral questions that video games are raising now, in much the same way that we've always experienced them in novels and movies. So video
Hmm.
games can get into some very weighty questions, and I found that fun. Uh, I You mentioned my own cheating in video games. I did that mainly in some of the early text-based games because they're so long, like Zork and Colossal Cave Adventure. These games are so enormous, and text-based. Just typing two-word commands into my computer, and I had so many more games that I wanted to write about that I felt like I just wanted to hit the fast forward button. So I did
Uh-huh.
look up some cheat codes on YouTube, and things like that, to get through a couple games faster than I would have liked. Um, my hope will be at some point maybe I'll go back and play them the way they're meant to be played. But that was more just for the sake of this book taking me 2 years instead of 20.
Yeah.
And even with cutting corners from time to time in some of the text-based games, I still couldn't get to everything that I wanted to. I still couldn't budget the time to be more comprehensive.
Hmm. That's
But
interesting. Go ahead.
in real life, if I catch myself cutting corners, or not doing a job the right way, like building a shelf, or mowing the small backyard that we have, or whatever it is, if I find myself not doing something the right way, I kind of I get irritated with myself. I don't sleep well, knowing that I've done something poorly. So
Hmm.
on a personal level, I don't think that carries over from my real life into my gaming life. My gaming selves, I'm perfectly happy to cheat when necessary. I try not to do that too much in real life.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important and really interesting point, right? Is that separation between ourselves in real life and ourselves online. And when you talk about things even outside of video games, like online harassment
Mhm.
and just all kinds of crazy stuff that people post, there's that weird separation of our identities for some reason, and that's really interesting to me. I don't know how that's happened so easily.
Mhm. So you have a Twitter feed, I guess, John?
I don't really use Twitter.
Okay. Are you
Yeah,
on Facebook,
I am on Facebook.
dating apps?
I am.
Um, you've got probably a bank account app. You've got all these different versions of yourself spread out across a whole lot of different media. You've
Hmm.
got your avatar here on Skype, which we're using to record this conversation. You've
Mm-hmm.
got you've got all these different versions of yourself spread out across the web or the internet. Um, Walt Whitman has that great famous quote, I'm large, I contain multitudes. And it was about how we each contain so many different personalities, that we have different voices and we can be inconsistent and still be true to ourselves. What the digital age has done is it's no longer that we contain multitudes, it's that we are multitudes, that
Mm.
my versions of myself extend beyond my body, and it's that my character in World of Warcraft is part me somehow. My Twitter feed is part me. The avatar on Facebook is part me. So all of these different Andrew Ervins exist in all of these different digital spaces, um, and that makes video gaming particularly interesting because, as you put it, there are these things that connect to our real lives in those other worlds. Your profile on a dating app is you, and it's not you. It's a carefully cultivated version of yourself.
Right.
Uh, so there's truth to it, but there's selective truth. I think that's true of any digital representation of ourselves, whether it's in a video game or elsewhere. So
Mm.
it's towards the end of the book, I start to discuss like online harassment, trolling, as you brought up, as people exploring the worst parts of themselves or the worst versions of themselves. Um, and I guess being anonymous allows for that a lot of the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I mean, that's an interesting point about, I've got versions of myself everywhere, but I think you're right in that it's the anonymous ones that really can be the most dangerous in terms of how you treat other people, because there's generally not an easy way to figure out who's who.
That's right, and it takes a particularly pernicious form in video gaming with violence and threats against women.
Hmm.
There are some tremendous female critics, like the Feminist Frequency series on YouTube and other sources, who talk about Gamergate and other forms of online harassment in ways that I could never accomplish. That their experiences are so awful and so, in some ways, unique to the times, that it's worth hearing their stories. Uh, what I did try to do, however, was show the influence of women programmers on the medium, a topic that
Hmm.
hasn't come up a great deal. I did try to look at the statistics of almost 50% of gamers are now women, and yet women are still harassed serially online. It's there's this toxic culture um, in gaming that still persists, and I'm hoping that by talking about it, by getting that out in the open, we can start to dispel that a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah. I hope so too. You touch on the idea of creativity from limitations many times throughout the book.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so talk a little bit about some of your favorite examples from how this played out in the video game world and maybe what we can learn from that.
There's this I guess in the history of video games is the history of different thinkers and programmers trying to do as much as they possibly can, given the limited amount of resources at their disposal, whether it's the small chip inside an Atari 26 cartridge, or it was, in the mid 90s, I suppose, when we started to use CD-ROMs for the first time. And all of a sudden, video games became huge. They became these massive um, worlds within worlds of uh, the resources at our disposal as programmers just became so big that the games could get so much more complex. And maybe there are a lot of benefits to that. We can get more immersive worlds, we can get more colors, we can get more cleaner animation, things like that. But there's also something that goes missing. If we have unlimited resources, everything is available to us. Um, I suppose that's mostly good, or it's neither good nor bad. Um, but there is something to be said for learning how to work within limitations, to having to problem solve on a smaller scale.
Hmm.
Seems like something that we may never have to do again, unless we decide to go program all the Atari cartridges again.
Well, no, that's an interesting point. I mean, I was going to ask later, but that gets in a little bit to what I was thinking about in terms of the future of games, right?
Mm,
Because I think it's to some extent this constant back and forth because there is new technology that comes out, but that new technology is going to have new constraints. And so maybe it's a constant push, right? And
mm,
so I mean, you talked about Super Mario World and how the advances allowed new possibilities for telling stories, and I think that's what you're talking about here. And
mhm.
but then we're getting into new things. So we're getting into stuff like VR now, and VR gaming, and AR, and augmented reality, and virtual reality gaming, and those currently have a different set of constraints on them that people are just starting to learn how to deal with, I would argue. So I'm just curious, do you feel like those is that right? Are those new constraints, or do you think that it's still part of the same idea? We're still working from the same set of limitations as before.
Uh, you're getting at a really very interesting and huge philosophical question, and that's the attempt to create the most realistic simulation of reality possible.
Hmm.
Whether it's on a black and white TV screen in the 1970s, I'm sure they wanted um, Pac-Man to look like good, clean animation and move sharply and have bright colors. Um, Up into the present day, where we've got this integration of reality on our phones with augmented reality. We put on these silly goggles for virtual reality. We're doing everything we can to make our simulations as real as possible. But they're never going to be anything other than simulations. However clean, bright, shiny, impressive, awesome, all inspiring they are, they're always going to be simulations. And I wonder if we're just pushing the limits further and further and further away from us in some regards, that we're just making nicer, bigger, more encompassing versions of the same thing. It's
Hmm.
tennis for two, this one little thing bouncing back and forth on an oscilloscope. I don't even think it was a pixel, honestly. Um, it's That at the time was a technological marvel. Here's a simulation of a tennis game. How incredible in
Hmm.
1958. Um, we laugh at it now, I suppose. So, and 60 years from now, we'll laugh at the pictures of us wearing these goggle headsets, or walking down the sidewalk staring down at our phones. That there's the integration between the digital and the human is going to continue in fascinating ways. If I don't really have the answers to what that's going to look like next, I can't imagine it's going to be Google Glasses, um, but it could be.
My vote is for contacts. I think we'll have contacts, and they'll be digital displays right on our field of vision. No one will know.
Oh, that'll be so much fun.
Yeah.
Ocular implants and imagine just having these playing a game without physical technology, that it's somehow embedded in our bodies already. Um, and then the ads, of course, get served to us, in the backs of our eyeballs.
Right. The bit dystopian perhaps, but that's okay.
Uh, yeah, I don't know if that's dystopian or not. It
No.
probably is. Um, I I tend not to think of progress as progress, or evolution as progress. I think
Hmm.
we adapt to our circumstances, and the technology adapts to our circumstances. And at a certain point, we're going to start adapting ourselves to the technology instead of vice versa. We're
Hmm.
going to start changing our physical selves in more and more radical ways. I think that could be kind of interesting. I don't know if that's necessarily good nor bad.
Yeah. Fair enough. Uh, yeah. One thing you wrote that I thought was real interesting was when you talked about Miyamoto's Mario games, and that
Mm-hmm.
we have to really work hard and practice. And the key I thought here was repeatedly fail in
Mm-hmm.
order to get further along. Because I don't think that's a notion that everybody necessarily subscribes to. And it's not something that we, push to our kids, I think sometimes. I don't think we're always saying, well, you guys, you should be failing a lot, which, but I agree. I think that's key. You have to know how to deal with failure. So I thought it might be helpful to hear about a time in your life that you kind of went through this cycle where you worked hard, you practiced, you failed, and you went back and worked hard again and kind of grew a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like you had any moments like that in your life, kind of outside of a video game environment?
As a writer, I think one gets accustomed to failure pretty quickly.
Mm,
That whether it's trying to publish stories or poems, or trying to get a career going, is certainly, this is rife with failure. But the real failures are staring at a sentence, trying to make these ideas that I have make sense on the page, to make sense in words, to have the words in the right order. That the constant failure that goes into writing every sentence in every book, I think is terrifying, and it's also enormously rewarding. Like the
mm,
reason I write is because I love that time. I love the quiet time. I love the intense focus that I can get into while writing. It's unlike any other experience that I'm aware of. It has, some things in common with exercise. It has some things in common with meditation, but there's this experience of the challenge of writing, is constant failure, nonstop,
mm-hmm.
constant failure, and eventually, being satisfied in some small way enough to move on to the next sentence, and then repeating that process again, and then going back to your office or my computer the next day and starting it all over. It can be a very grueling process, but it's also the most rewarding thing in the world. And I agree with your point that we do need to make failure acceptable. We do need to make failure treat failure as something beneficial in every way. Um, I think that our failures make us who we are just as much or more than our successes.
Mm,
And
yeah.
Mario games in particular, that it's we have to learn a certain set of techniques on a controller in order to pass certain trials or puzzles, and the constant failure. It can get frustrating, but hopefully frustrating in entertaining, performative ways.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's interesting to me too. One of the tricks is that you have to, I think video game designers probably face this in that they have to make the game challenging but not too challenging for a really wide audience, right? If there are some people that will fail but eventually get it, and then they'll feel some accomplishment, they'll like it, but the majority of people can't get it, then people criticize a game for being too hard. But if the game does not is not intense enough, or there's not enough failure that's needed. They might get criticized for being too easy.
Mm.
So, I mean, do you have any thoughts about how are video game designers kind of walking that gap? How are they deciding, well, okay, hopefully millions of people will play this. What is going to be just the right amount of easy and hard?
Well, I imagine at the massive level, the multi-million dollar games, the $10 million seller games, the Call of Duties, the huge big budget games, I imagine there are models in place
Hmm.
where they know exactly what level of challenge and difficulty is acceptable to their core audience. And I suspect that most games also have variable levels of difficulty. So you can play the easy mode, or you can play the difficult mode, or you can play the impossible mode.
Yeah.
Uh, but the games that are of more interest to me, and I think to this book, are the ones created by an individual making a game that she enjoys herself. Miles Davis used to play with his back to the audience, and he would say, "Who cares if you listen?" When I write a short story, I'm basically writing it for myself. I'm writing it for um, people I love, and I'm writing it for personal reasons. If it reaches an audience beyond that, that's wonderful, and that makes me very happy. A lot of what I write doesn't do that. A lot of what I write is difficult and esoteric, and isn't a crowd pleasing sort of thing. So the video games I like, the level of difficulty is inherent in the personality of the individual creators. That it's
Hmm.
a decision made on a case by case basis by these individual artists. I think that's kind of the fun. The game we were talking about earlier, the Castle Doctrine by Jason Rohrer, I find it incredibly difficult and frustrating, um, but I also really enjoy that about it.
Hmm. Sometimes it's nice to be challenged at a really high level.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of different ways that we can be challenged, whether it's some sort of dexterity with a complex controller, or whether it's intellectual puzzles, or there are video games that can do any one of those kinds of challenges that we want.
I want to talk. You mentioned this very briefly at the beginning, but I want to talk a little bit more about escapism and addiction in terms of games. And so there's one game you mentioned, World of Warcraft,
Mm-hmm.
and so you started that, you stopped it, you started it again. It's this big, massive online game where millions of people are playing all the time, and has been around for many years now. And it's kind of a poster child for what's been going on there. And so maybe just talk about World of Warcraft and maybe the social rituals you had around that. You talked about how you played it with family,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of how that turned into unhealthy escapism, and what the dangers are there.
World of Warcraft is probably one of the most iconic and popular video games that's ever been played. At one point, I think there were over 10 million people playing. It is an amazing cultural phenomenon, and it um, allows for social interaction in a way that I have not experienced in other video games, where there are millions of people, or hundreds of thousands of people occupying the same digital space at the same time. And so the interactions happen with the environment that's created by the game makers, but it also happens among multiple players. And so the dynamic there is incredibly fun and incredibly rewarding. Um, but that game, and a lot of others, also employ many of the techniques that, for instance, casinos do to keep people putting dimes in slot machines. These small um, small rewards that push us towards the next small reward and the next small reward, and the hope of eventually a slightly bigger reward. Uh, World of Warcraft and other video games, some other video games, do that enormously well. And the psychology is brilliant and fascinating, and terrifying for people who might get addicted to this.
Hmm.
I mentioned earlier I had a friend who was a full on World of Warcraft addict, over 40, 50 hours a week on this game. That that was consistent with other addictions in his life. And so there's perhaps a personality type or personality types that are more apt to stay in the casino around the clock, putting money in the slot machines. A lot of us, you know, gamble a little bit at a time for pleasure. For a lot of us, it becomes uh, addictive or troubling in some way. The closest I've personally come to video game addiction was not nearly as bad as some of the instances I've read about where children get endangered, or like my friend was spending 50 hours a week online. I never did anything like that. Um, but I did catch myself thinking a lot about this game, even when I wasn't playing, and wondering, well, where are my friends? I wonder what they're doing now while I'm not online. And um, thinking about what I would do when I went back to my computer. Um, would I work toward this goal? Would I try to do that? And so there's certainly an element of some video games where we can get hooked, we can get obsessive, and they have turned deadly,
Hmm.
as some stories I recount in the book describe. Uh, Fortunately, I only got the slightest hint of that in my own life, so that worked out okay for me. But for parents out there, I do recommend keeping an eye on your children's screen time. I'm sure most people already do that, but with a game that's designed to keep people glued to the computer, it's certainly worth um, overseeing that a little bit.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you brought up casinos, and it made me think of the fact that casinos are very highly regulated,
Mm-hmm.
and there are rules surrounding how much they are allowed, how much they can allow players to play. I think there is, like, if they see people that are clearly addicted, like, they have to make some effort to stop them or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I might be totally wrong, but I was just curious if you thought, like, is that a responsibility that video game makers should have? Because presumably they know who their hardcore addicts are. They can look up and say, okay, so and so played 80 hours last week. Probably that's not a healthy amount that they should be playing. Do they have a responsibility to reach out to that person? Should the government have a responsibility to make sure they're doing that, or should we just let these people play all they want?
Oh, that's an impossible and awesome question, John. Wow. I think there's certainly a moral necessity on the part of the video game makers, where if they recognize that the work they're doing causes impairment in the lives of their customers, that's horrible and disgusting. But we also have, people creating products that they know um, people are going to buy them, even if they can't afford them. We have soft drink manufacturers doing everything they can, or snack food brands making their food as addictive as possible, just so people will
Sure.
keep eating this junk food no matter what. Um, so to look for some sense of moral code um, in a capitalist market economy. Um, I'd like to think that video game makers are conscious of this and will do the right thing. But again, I think we're drawing the same line between the big for-profit brands like Blizzard Entertainment, which makes Warcraft, or the companies that makes these popular multimedia multi-million-dollar games. Clearly, their motive is profit. Their motive is not art. Their motive is not an emotional journey. If they have a little bit of that in order to create better profits, sure. The games central to my book, the games that I'm excited about, are not profit motivated. They are about making connections with other people. They are about thinking through challenging questions, thinking about honesty, morality, atonement. There are all these different things that video games can do and do well, that can maybe do better than any other medium. Uh, but the companies that are in it just to add to their wealth, no, I can't imagine that they care if I spend 80 hours a week playing World of Warcraft. I think that someone would get a bonus somewhere if they saw that I started playing a new video game and started donating or dedicating that much of my time to it. I think that's what
Hmm.
they want.
Yeah.
But again, those aren't the games that I care about.
Right. And so to transition, yeah, I want to quickly talk about Journey because that was I really liked that game, and this is one of the ones I went online and looked up, and
Mhm.
I thought it was just fascinating. So maybe talk about Journey quickly, and you wrote about how it breaks down barriers between players without using language. So I'm curious both about the game itself and kind of what that idea suggests about our own identities.
You see that?
Yeah,
That's from Journey.
that's Journey. You're wearing a Journey shirt right
Just,
now. I
just
like it.
by coincidence, not the band. Uh, uh, Journey is a game that takes an idea you and I talked about a little while ago and flips it on its head, where it's being anonymous online that allows for every manner of abuse and harassment. That
Hmm.
if everybody used their own real names on Twitter, for instance, that there would probably be almost no harassment. It's the ability to excuse me. It's the ability to hide behind an avatar and a screen name that allows for all of these awful situations. Journey is a game where the players are completely anonymous, where there's no language in the game. There are no words at all. It is a. It's almost like participating in a symphony as much as in a video game. We play a character known as the Traveler who's crossing through a desert and through all these different landscapes in order to get to a mountain off in the distance. The music is stunning. The visuals are stunning. Everything about it is absolutely brilliant. The creator or the designer behind it, his name is Genova Chen, young man out in California. It is an absolute artistic masterpiece. No, I have no hesitation in calling it that. Um, because it can be played solo. It can also be played online, where you will encounter another traveler along the way, and there's no method to communicate with this person vocally, and we don't know who the person is. There's nothing to tie it to a screen name or a Sony account or anything like that. It could be my next door neighbor, or it could be, a 90-year-old woman in Iceland, or it could be a 6-year-old boy in Brazil. There's no knowing whatsoever who the other traveler is. Um, and so you decide, are you going to work together to help solve problems and find one's way? Are you going to go separate ways? Um, and the number of times I played it, I would experiment with jumping around or trying to get someone's attention, um, and I found that people would almost always try to help each other in the circumstance, and follow each other and complete puzzles together. And one eventually gets separated from the other. It's just part of the way the game mechanics work. But there's something incredibly lovely about the fact that it's wordless. And I interviewed a lot of these video game makers for the book, including Genova Chen. And he told me that he thought that language could be a barrier to communication, that he thought there could be a different kind of meaningful interaction, that it is enhanced by the fact that we're not talking. We don't have even a name for the other person. And I found that beautiful. And that's a game that I would wholeheartedly recommend to everybody. That's a great place to start one's video gaming.
Yeah, and so the way that you talked about Journey right now, you said it was a masterpiece. You use words to describe it that we would use when it comes to art more broadly.
Mm-hmm,
So this kind of lets me transition into your chapter about the art question. You
mm-hmm.
devote a whole chapter to it. Maybe talk about what that is in the context of video games and why you wanted to wait till the end of the book to bring it up.
Well, I don't think it's a big sneaky reveal at the end. Ta-da! Video games are art, because
Yeah.
I talk about art throughout the entire game. Excuse me. I talk about art throughout the entire book. It's toward the end where I get into this long debate that's gone on online about whether or not games are art. And some people say definitively yes, and some people say definitively no. The film critic Roger Ebert wrote this now famous blog post that video games can never be art. And there's no agreement about this, not among video gamers, not among video game makers, not among nobody has come up with a consensus if video games are art or not. Um, there are games in the permanent collection at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. The Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. has done a big art of video games exhibition. One can earn an MFA, Master of Fine Arts degree in video game design at lots of different universities now. So there's certainly some inclusion of video games within the traditional art world. My take on it is that the best video games are art. Not every movie is a work of art. Not every book is a work of art. John, you should see my paintings. They're awful. But I love painting them. I love drawing. I'm not good at it, but my sketches are by no means works of art. But Michelangelo's were. So that there's within video games, there's a lot of crap. There's a lot of total and absolute garbage. Those violent games that neither you or I like. Games where the whole model is to keep people clicking and charging in-app fees for more things, and there's a lot of terrible video games out there, just like there are a lot of terrible movies. The games that are great, the Journeys and the Castle Doctrines, Gravity Ghost, there are games that are as profound works of art as any in any museum, and that's not the majority of games. But they're certainly out there. And I hope my book can help some people, even non-gamers like myself, find some of those games and recognize exactly what this medium can accomplish artistically.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And to further kind of wrap our discussion up, is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you hope the reader would learn or take away from your book?
I suppose the last thing I would talk about in that regard is that the idea of community that can exist online, if we silence the trolls, if we form a community that's nurturing online, a video gaming community that's egalitarian and cool and feminist and all of those things, it's I think that's possible. I think it's necessary, and I think that's also going to be a whole lot of fun. So that the video gaming community that we build is entirely up to us, and I'm super excited to be part of a gaming community going forward that is cooler and more radical and more introspective and more intellectually astute than it has been in the past.
Sounds great. I'm with you. So let's wrap it all up. We'll do what I call my thunder round. I'll ask you a couple quick questions, and we'll call it a day. Sound good?
Sounds great, John.
All right. So what's your favorite food or drink?
I love lasagna more than just about any other food item in the world. Drink, you're going to think I'm kidding, and I'm not. I love Philadelphia tap water. Yeah, it's really good and very clean, and I keep it in the fridge, ice cold or almost ice cold, and I love it.
That sounds good. I mean, no, up here in New York, we're very passionate about our tap water as well.
Oh,
it's
good.
Delicious. So, and I drink it every day. So that is not crazy. That is
Great.
100% okay. But that makes me happy to know that there are other places that have great tap water. So now I know when I visit Philly. Yeah, and where's your favorite place you've ever been?
I lived in Budapest for a number of years right after college, and I miss the Hungarian countryside a great deal, and my Hungarian friends and family. More recently, my wife and I spent the winter solstice, New Year's in Ireland last year. Really loved the west coast of Ireland, and look forward to going back there soon. But again, I've traveled a lot since growing up in the Philly suburbs, and about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, moved back to Philly. And just I love this city. It is a world class city, unlike any other. And I'm a huge Philly fan. So I love
That's,
being here.
well, that's great, and I'm glad you've found your home. So I'll
Have,
wrap it up. One
have
last
you
question.
have
What's
you
that?
been to, have you been to Philly, John?
I have been once, in fact, with some friends, and we've kind of wandered around. But I have not been in a while, so perhaps I'm overdue.
I hope you make it soon.
Yeah, me too. Um, so if you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
Mm. Um, I suppose in the context of our discussion today, I would love to see uh, people treating each other online with the same dignity and respect that they would in real life.
Mm, great answer, and I hope so too. All right. Well, again, I want to thank Andrew Ervin for being my guest today. The book is Bit by Bit. It's out now. It's wonderful and very thoughtful, and I hope everyone goes out and buys it. So thanks again, Andrew, for being on the show.
John, I'm honored to be here. I'm grateful that you took the time to read the book, ask such great questions. I appreciate it a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.